Well, summer's in full swing, and I hope you all haven't missed me too much. I've been busy working on the next season and generally tidying up the place a bit, but I thought I'd drop in for one last spin of the wheel before the new season starts in September to talk about something that'll really raise the heat. And, as is custom with these summer specials, I'm not alone, as joining me on this very special summer fling is none other than a gentleman scholar, horror enthusiast and all-round lovely chap, Mike from Rotted Reviews. Man, it's a delight to have you on. How's it going?
It's going pretty darned well. I'm doing ducky. I appreciate you having me on and talking about this late 70s horror movie. I always love the opportunity to talk about stuff that often goes under the radar, even if it sometimes deserves its lower placement within the shadows outside of the limelight.
Very true, and I couldn't agree more. So, today's film is 1979's Don't Go in the House. It's a stalker proto-slasher movie that has the honour of being one of the first don't movies released during the don't craze of the late 70s and early 80s. Essentially, for a period of around about 5 years from 1978 to 1983, there was a fairly long-running string of movies all united by the simple fact that they were informing audiences not to do something. You had Don't Go in the House, Don't Answer the Phone, Don't Go into the Woods, Don't Go near the Park. The list's as long as my arm and runs sporadically pretty much from 1973 to the present day. But it was between 78 and 83 that the don't titling went particularly wild. And while Don't Go in the House narrowly avoided being a full-blown Section 1 video nasty, it did manage to end up on the Section 2 list, and at this point I should probably talk about the video nasty lists because I don't believe I've ever gone into detail on this in the past, but there were actually 3 different video nasty lists. Section 1 was your out-and-out banned nasty. These were 39, initially 40, movies that, if you were caught with them, you'd get prosecuted, your tapes would be destroyed, and odds are you'd be put in jail or heavily fined. And we're talking thousands here. Then there was Section 2 films. These were movies that the prosecutors weren't 100% convinced they were capable of landing a guilty verdict for ownership on, so basically if you had one of these and you fought hard enough, the judge might just let you off with a slap on the wrist and confiscate your tapes. A short time after that, a third list saw the light of day. Section 3 films were completely untested as to whether they could get a prosecution, and as such, the list was never put into active enforcement. But really, this was more of a list of films with suspicious titles or themes that the police could use to potentially help locate and identify Section 1 and 2 tapes. So, now that we're all on the same page, the film follows Donnie, a, shall we say, disturbed individual who's working at an incineration site, and literally in the opening moments of the film, one of the technicians called Ben gets a face full of flames when a spray paint can explodes while the incinerator door is open. While the teams try to put him out, Donnie just kind of stands there, taking in what's happening. This is because Donnie has a quite troubled past. As a child, Donnie's mother would beat him for committing what she referred to as evil. In one particularly harrowing scene, after disobeying his mother, Donnie's mum grabs his arms and holds them over a fully lit stovetop. This act instilled in Donnie at a young age that fire is directly tied to evil or wrongdoing, and that if someone's getting burnt, it's because they're evil and needs to be punished or absolved of their sins. After the incident, Donnie's boss corners him and yells at him for not doing anything to try and save Ben. But Donnie is nonplussed by this, seeing the incident as Ben getting what he deserved. While leaving work, one of the team called Bobby chases after Donnie and tries to connect with him, suggesting the pair head to a bar to talk about what happened. But Donnie's insistent that he's got to get home to his mother, and after a few times of trying, Bobby eventually gives up and lets Donnie go home. While heading back, however, we find out that Donnie, on top of having this unusual internal punishment system, is also suffering from some rather severe mental health issues. Chief amongst them is a whispering female voice that only Donnie can hear, who reassures him that he's doing the right thing and that evil people deserve to burn. When Donnie arrives back, he almost immediately starts the evening by heading to the kitchen to make his mother a cup of tea. He takes the drink upstairs and while talking to his mum realises that something isn't quite right. She isn't responding, or paying attention, or breathing. Yes, after years of torment and suffering, Donnie's mother has passed away. And after initially being distraught, Donnie quickly realises that this means no more rules and no more punishments. He immediately heads out to touch all the ornaments in the house that he's not supposed to and blasts his stereo as loud as he can. It dawns on Donnie after a time that he's now completely alone, except for the voices, who tell him in no uncertain terms that he must burn his mother's body in order to absolve her of her sins and release the evil from her. Without much pushing, Donnie takes a few days off work, converts his basement into a metal incineration room, and while passing an antique store, he spots an old World War II asbestos-lined firefighting suit which he decides to pick up. On the way home, Donnie stops at a flower shop, and after pleading with the owner to let him in to buy something simple for his mum who's sick, the store owner eventually relents and lets Donnie in. This proves to be a big mistake for the flower store owner, however, as her taking pity on Donnie means that she's missed the last bus home in a very dodgy part of town. Luckily, Donnie is willing to repay the favour and offers to give her a ride home in his pickup. The ride back is a little frosty, and things only get frostier when Donnie says he needs to drop a package off at his house. When at the house, he suggests that the store owner, Kathy, comes in for a while and meets his mother. She's rightfully very strongly against the idea, but Donnie is so insistent that she just goes with it. Once inside the house, things begin to get quite uneasy. Donnie leaves Kathy to explore for a bit, and after scaring her by randomly popping out at her, Kathy decides enough is enough and that she wants out. She asks Donnie if she can use the phone to call a cab, and after a very tense standoff, Donnie lets her. But this triggers the voices and flashbacks to his mother, and in a fit of blind rage and fear, Donnie bludgeons Kathy, takes her down to the basement, strips her, chains her up, pours gasoline all over her, and sets her on fire with a flamethrower.
After this, we have a series of scenes in which Donnie appears to be targeting young women to meet the same fate as Kathy. He'll try and pick up a hitchhiker, attempt to initiate conversation with a woman at the bodega, and so forth. Donnie's descent seems nearly complete with his charred victims arranged in chairs ready for him to verbally admonish, but one element that is keeping him grounded is Bobby. His coworker and friend of seemingly infinite patience, Bobby continues to keep in touch with Donnie to let him know his job is on the line if he misses any more work, as well as keeping open a standing invite to hang out. After some interludes of verbally abusing his crispy menagerie and seeking clarity from the local priest, Donnie winds up calling Bobby to finally take him up on the offer and invites him to the movies. Bobby has a better idea though. What about getting together with some girls he has lined up already and joining him at the disco? This leads directly into an awkwardly long but still fascinating scene of Donnie attempting to get himself some new threads for a night of dancing. New duds acquired, Donnie meets Bobby at the disco and also meets the two women, joining them in his own brand of awkward conversation, complete with odd pauses and disconcerting fractured tones. Regardless, everyone seems intent on having a good time, and all is as well as can be expected until the unthinkable happens. Donnie's date, in an effort to get him off his butt and onto the dance floor, takes both of his hands in a playful urging motion, which just so happens to be above the candle resting comfortably under his wrists on the table. Triggering ensues. Donnie screams, leaps up, and smashes the lit candle against her head, igniting the 2 tons of Aquanet she had previously applied. Everyone freaks out. Bobby is stunned, and Donnie makes tracks. He's quickly caught by the now toasty woman's brother, who gets a few good licks in before Donnie scrambles to his truck and drives away. Never one to waste an opportunity, Donnie picks up 2 girls looking for a party and uses his freshly bloodied nose to tell a tale of him besting a trio of knife-wielding assailants. After some back and forth, Donnie convinces the 2 girls that a party at his house would be just as good, if not better. After they arrive at the house and Donnie is his signature awkward 5 red flag self, we see Bobby continuing to be the most stand-up friend in the history of cinema by seeking out Donnie's priest for some fast intervention. Soon they both arrive at the house, find the girls in the metal-lined basement, and help them get out. The priest is unfortunately caught by Donnie, armed with his trusty flamethrower, but still manages to make it outside where Bobby can extinguish him. Donnie is now all alone in the house. Or is he? Plagued by the voices seemingly in his head of the taunting coming from his burned victims as well as his mother, he eventually sees them move toward him menacingly. Donnie, in an act of simultaneous self-preservation and self-destruction, defends himself with the flamethrower, burning down the house with him inside. The last scene before the credits roll is a young boy named Michael being yelled at by his abusive mother while the report of the burned house is being broadcast over the radio. When his mother leaves the room, Michael begins hearing the same voices Donnie did as they whisper gently to him, and tears run down his cheeks.
So if I'm putting my cards on the table here, I didn't have as much love for this as most. Don't get me wrong, it's by no means a bad movie. It's absolutely watchable and has some genuinely entertaining moments in it. But for me, I'm having real difficulties trying to keep objective about this one because, well, I'm not the biggest fan of this type of film, and I've seen it done so much better by other filmmakers. I know that in many ways it's still an example of the proto-slasher genre in its embryonic infancy, but all the way through this film, in the back of my mind, I just kept saying to myself, Maniac and Christmas Evil did this kind of movie idea way better than this. And I appreciate that this came out before those movies. Hell, I'm not even the biggest fan of Maniac, but I'd probably prefer to watch those than this. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that from this point on, I'm going to try and review this film as an isolated product rather than how it measures up to its peers, because if I try and talk about this film in a comparative sense, I'm going to spend most of the review moaning that things within it have been done better elsewhere. So broadly, it wouldn't be my go-to for this kind of movie. There is better stuff out there, but this is a decent attempt in my opinion. I think the script for this film is actually pretty solid. There's a clear 3-act structure in place that fully supports the key narrative beats. You do really see a solid progression in Donnie as he goes from being a somewhat frit and timid character to becoming emboldened by his mother's death to a full transgression into a malicious bully who thinks he's in the right in the same way that his mother was to him. But all this isn't done in a heavy-handed way, it's gradual and works its way across the full runtime. While you never completely get a grip on exactly what Donnie wants out of all of this, the scriptwriters have woven just enough nudges and hints to help gradually steer the viewer into this development. And while I'm not going to say the film's particularly sensitive to Donnie's mental health issues, it very patiently eases Donnie's breakdown out of him over the hour and 22-minute runtime. Secondary characters don't really get that much development, which in some ways is a shame, but in other ways is kinda perfect, because if you take it that this film is following Donnie from his perspective, it would make sense that these people wouldn't really be much more than their surface level interpretation, because Donnie makes it very clear across the runtime that he doesn't want to know people, he's not interested. He just wants to seemingly burn people to absolve them and to get some kind of retribution for the hurt his mother caused him. In fact, the only time we do get anything resembling character development outside of Donnie is when he realises in the third act that he might be able to get to people if he suddenly decides to go all in on befriending Bobby, which in and of itself reveals a distinct layer of misogyny with Donnie, as when he's told point blank that Bobby wants to go to a disco with a couple of women with the express purpose of cheating on his wife, Donnie doesn't bat an eye. So if you're a guy and into adultery, totally fine. But if you're a woman and you piss on Donnie's hospitality and tell him you want to leave, you're getting cremated. I think the pacing of the script isn't unreasonable. If I was being a bit nitpicky, the second act in places does feel a bit nebulous, just after Donnie takes his third victim, but just before the Disco Inferno. What I will say is the first and third acts are very satisfying and do present a solid attempt at bringing you as an audience member into Donnie's world. I just feel that either the second act could be a bit more intentional or just a bit shorter because, as it stands, I personally found it a bit too fluffy. On a final note, I absolutely have to mention the dialogue here, which is really something else. It feels very naturalistic to me, given some of the schlock I've had to sit through in my time where it feels like the majority of the cast are reading their lines for the first time off cue cards behind the camera. This felt very immersive. It was very fluid and genuine. In part, this will be down to some rather solid performances, but honestly, this is some of the better dialogue I've seen written for a video nasty title. It's just a good, solid, well-crafted piece of work.
I would have to agree on a lot of your points. I thought this was a relatively solid movie that followed its own path well without straying too far and getting lost in its own narrative. I also didn't have as much love for it as most. Sometimes, oftentimes really, the opportunity to have well-developed characters can get sacrificed for the sake of shock value in language, sex, or violence. And I'm a big advocate for the notion that with some care and consideration, you can still have it all. The thing that impressed me about Don't Go in the House was the care it gave to its characters. They felt independent of one another, each with their unique motivations and tics that allowed them to feel more fleshed out than I was expecting. There were some scenes that felt too drawn out, and while some just flat out put me in a zombie trance, others actually managed to be charming. Just as Donnie was awkward in his cadence, so too was this film. The clothes shopping scene in particular felt completely unnecessary, yet somehow still engaging, and was low-key one of my inexplicably favorite scenes in the movie.
The script was written by Joe Macefield, Ellen Hamill, and was also co-written and directed by Joseph Ellison. Ellen has 2 writing credits, this film and a movie called Joey. As for Joe, this is his only writing credit, but he does have a rather interesting resume as a sound editor, with titles including The Evil Dead, Savage Dawn, and Alone in the Dark. As for Joseph, is there anything you can find, Mike?
Apparently he grew up with both a love of music and a strong sense of morality, which makes for an interesting contrasting dynamic between his childhood and the circumstances portrayed in this film. He fell in love with the works of Fellini, which inspired his character path into film, and from there he worked on a number of small exploitation productions before setting off on his own with Don't Go in the House. Unfortunately, the film generally wasn't well received by major audiences. Not entirely unfounded accusations of misogyny, coupled with negative critical reviews, and regular movie-going audiences finding the tone difficult and uncomfortable, it caused Ellison to take a long break before coming back to the director's chair one more time for the little scene drama Joey, which then put him squarely into retirement.
Wow, what a bummer. That's a hell of a way to crash out. Well, on the direction front, while I can't say that I feel that this is the most original work put to celluloid, it does do what it does surprisingly well. One of the big motifs you'll notice throughout this film is fire. Everything has fire in it, whether it's flame-tipped stovetops, shots of flamethrowers or incinerators, the candles that fill Donnie's apartment or the church. Even in Donnie's dreams, fire is a prominent feature. And this really helps in establishing the identity of the movie because it ties itself so closely to fire that it almost in effect becomes its branding. Like, after watching this thing, if you were to ask me what the main thing I remember about it was, my answer would be fire or people getting set on fire. And in cementing that branding, I think Ellison really went a long way to leaving his mark on this film. No pun intended. Okay, maybe a little intended. It should also be noted that here he's been able to simultaneously give the house a presence of being both a sprawling and confusing labyrinth and an oppressive jail cell. With shots of Donnie wandering the house seeming almost endless and rooms shooting off in every direction, it becomes very easy to lose your place in this house, which can at times really help drive that sense of unease, especially with the lighting choices, which are often quite dim or artificial feeling. In fact, this film does suffer a little bit on the lighting front, with some shots having an almost floodlit look to them, which I get that was a point of necessity rather than creative choice. Personally, it reminded me of 1974's Black Christmas for that, but it did kind of take me out of the action from time to time. Contrasting the sprawling mansion and the moody lighting though, the director really goes above and beyond to really drive home that this mansion is in essence Donnie's world. It's the place where he feels most in control, but because of that it also makes it the only place he can really feel that he can be open and honest. As such, Ellison really makes you feel through the direction that Donnie is effectively trapped in his own history, unable to grow beyond the 4 walls that grew him into the individual he is today, which is done, I think, rather superbly. As for direction of the cast, it's pretty solid. We have a lot of set space being utilised very effectively, props are used rather well throughout, and I feel like the cast were in constant communication with the director because both seem to be working seemingly effortlessly in tandem to create something that, even while bordering on the paranormal at times, feels quite believable. The director here has really managed to pull the best out of these actors, and it really shows.
I mentioned earlier that a lot of regular movie-going audiences were uncomfortable with this movie, and I think a lot of that is due to the directorial choices that were made here. That's not to say they didn't work or were ineffective. I more think this was a case of a new breed of horror lovers entering the world of late 70s and early 80s slashers, encountering a cruel and awkward film with the villain in the driver's seat providing the perspective. And that can be a tough pill to swallow. So while things may have been difficult for people just looking for teenagers to get slashed up and have monsters pop out of the dark, riding shotgun with Donnie and getting inside his head was something I found to be thrilling, and I actually thought that Ellison pulled off the direction to achieve that very effectively. You are absolutely right about the house being the sprawling labyrinth, and I quite enjoyed that. 9 times out of 10, when so many scenes are set in such a contained space, I'll advocate for using a lot of directors' tricks to establish subliminal geographical space references. Particular angles, color palettes, music, lighting unique to each area gives the audience a reference point and lets them know where people are in relation to each other, even if they don't know those tricks are being employed. That 1 time out of 10, though, it's good to see almost purposeful confusion and those references thrown out the window, because it helps put us in the shoes of Donnie's victims, and the confusion they feel very much make this his house and his domain.
Another area where this film shines for me has got to be the Cine, which I think just about gets the balance right between looking professional but having some room to experiment. There's been a real solid eye given to the composition of shots, and the rule of thirds is almost constantly in use throughout this film. It's clear that scenes were blocked properly and that there was a decent communication between the director and the DOP to achieve what they've done here. Sequences are sturdily constructed with real consideration given to showing rather than telling the audience what's going on. And I'm really impressed with the amount of shot types used within a sequence range. It never feels like they're overstuffing or just inserting shots for the sake of it. But the consideration on show in using well-placed Dutch angles, the occasional track and pan, and even some effects shots and overlays all goes a long way to getting this film up and looking great. Is it perfect? No. Some shots are a little underexposed, particularly ones at night, which do leave the occasional shot here and there looking quite overly grainy, and in my personal opinion there are at least a couple of instances where dialogue scenes were shot as mid-wide, whereas personally I'd have maybe gone in a little closer. Maybe a mid-close-up or even a close-up reverse shot type scenario, just to get the audience really up close and personal with the cast. But these are just minor grumbles, really, on what is ultimately a really decent job.
Again, with video nasties and exploitation films, it can be a real mixed bag as far as cinematography goes. So when I come across a movie like this that not only tells the story well, but frames it well, it's an unexpected joy. Outdoor night shots in the 70s were exceptionally tricky to pull off without significant grain, but other than that, I really didn't find too many sins hiding in the camera work.
Performance-wise, we have some really heavy-hitting performances here. Particularly Dan Grimaldi as Donnie, who really gives it his all in this role, coming across as genuinely sincere in his motivations, but utterly unhinged in his methodology towards it. He kind of has this frenetic energy which makes his performance come off as unpredictable, which is perfect for this kind of role, as you absolutely don't want your audience to know where things are going. Whenever Grimaldi was on screen, I never felt entirely safe as an audience member. I felt he was perfect for the role and really nailed the part. I also have to give credit to Joanna Bruchet as Kathy, the flower shop owner. She's Donnie's first victim, and in the 10 or so minutes she's on screen, she really gets a chance to work a full range of emotions, going from polite but firm to full-on traumatised and every emotion in between. I was genuinely impressed by how believable her reactions were to the situations that were unfolding. She's believable, and while her on-screen time was brief, it was very much appreciated and enjoyed. The rest of the supporting cast are all pretty solid too, in fairness, giving performances that range from alright to good. The only actor I feel maybe didn't quite fit the bill was Robert Carnegie as Bobby. Not strictly because he gives a bad performance, but rather because he appears to have chosen to perform his role with a more than decent slab of ham. And hey, I love ham as much as the next person, but here it falls a bit tonally flat for me. Like the hillbilly music in Last House on the Left, he just doesn't quite fit the tone of the rest of the picture, and as a result, rather than acting as a nice complementing contrast, his scenes go quite against the grain, leading to a lesser experience in my opinion. Like I say though, he's not bad, it's just a bit too different.
This is one area that I'm going to slightly disagree with you. I also loved Dan Grimaldi's performance as Donnie. He pulled off such an intense display of social outcast and nervous awkwardness while never letting go of an undertone of menace. This is one area in which writing, direction, and acting meet in perfect harmony. Kick out just one of those legs and the whole thing falls over. So the words on the page for Dan to deliver were dynamic and interesting, and it was a delight for him to provide this truly uncomfortable performance that seems to have been this film's double-edged sword. Where we don't see eye to eye is Robert Carnegie as Bobby, and it's not that we disagree on the ham factor, it was absolutely there. But I was actually happy to have it there, and it made the Bobby character one of my favorites. As Donnie is falling down the rabbit hole of his own making, from a storytelling point of view, it is important to provide him with a grounding element that keeps one toe right on the edge of normal. It also highlights that the voices in his head are continuing to lie to him, and that despite how he may feel, he is, in fact, not alone. Against all odds, he has a friend that is stupidly passionate about not giving up on him. Given the seriousness of everything dark in Donnie's world, the bright spot having a side of ham delivered with it was actually a touch of brilliance in my opinion, and Carnegie was a joy for me to watch on screen.
No, that's a very valid point, man. I mean, I can see how having that grounding element there can help to both ground Donnie whilst also complementing and amplifying the darker and more subtle tones of his character when those moments arise. And finally, the soundtrack. And for this film, it's perfect. It's moody, dark, heavy and powerful synths at their bleakest and grungiest. It creates such an oppressive atmosphere that smothers the audience like a weighted blanket. One thing I thought was a really nice touch is that they occasionally interweave the sound of hissing gas and raging firecrackles into the score to help even further enhance the burning motif that's running through this thing. Barring some slightly ropey ADR in places, which, again, can pull you out of the mood of this thing, I really liked it. I wouldn't want to listen to it isolated, but I feel it really works here.
Yeah, so we're back to being in full agreement on this score, pun intended. The synths and the organs were great, and at the risk of reaching pinnacle pretentiousness, I appreciate the notes not played. This film wasn't afraid to let particular moments stand perfectly quiet at times, which helped the uneasy feelings quite a bit. When action did start, the synths and organs were ready and waiting to deliver. The plinking percussion that was almost sing-song in its delivery during the flashback scenes of Donnie's mother burning his arms was a good counterbalance to the horrific nature of what he was going through at that time.
Don't Go in the House was initially released uncut in 1982 by Arcade Video, who later re-released a cut version for approval by the BBFC in 1987. It finally got an uncut release in 2011 on DVD and arrived on Blu-ray in 2022 by Arrow Video and Severin Films, who really went above and beyond with the release of this thing. Included are both the theatrical and extended editions, alongside a ton of extra features around the film's creation and release. And if you were lucky like me and pre-ordered directly from Severin or Arrow, then you also got a third disc as a bonus, including the Nasty Cut. A great addition to this set that presents the film exactly as it was when it was released by Arcade in 1982, ripped directly from an original VHS release. And I feel with the Nasties we should really standardise including the original VHS release ripped and upscaled on the set. So many of these movies rely on the lower resolutions, and the VHS of Don't Go in the House is a totally different experience to the Blu-ray quality release. Also included are upscaled versions of the UK cinema release in 2K and the option to watch the UK cinema release in open matte and widescreen modes, and there's even an option to watch it in cinema mode, which tags a load of vintage cinema trailers and cinema notices at the beginning for the full-blown theatrical experience. Don't Go in the House may not, in my opinion, be the best example of the slasher stalker genre, but it is a good example of it. What we have here is a good solid script married up to some fun and interesting Cine direction with a decent range of actors, topped off with a score that really is the bow on top of the present for me. While I'll be the first to admit that the lower than normal budget is noticeable in places throughout this, they've worked with what they've got amicably, and I feel they've done a pretty decent job here. I think there's absolutely better than this out there, but for what it is, it's great.
I try very hard to evaluate films on their own merits, from opening credits to end credits, and nothing from the outside influencing my scores. So while I have a strong emotional attachment and personal fascination with video nasties, I also have to begrudgingly admit that a fair number of them just aren't that great. I was pleased to find that Don't Go in the House was one that I did enjoy and found to be a quality film in its own right. Yes, it did meander a bit, and I did find myself checking out at some drawn-out moments. And while I appreciate any film taking on the immensely difficult task of actually delivering fiery scenes of immolation and all the practical effect risks that come with that territory, there were some rotoscoped fire effects that were laughably bad. But for all the good elements of this film, I was willing to forgive a lot of sins, and I actually found myself somewhat charmed by any blemishes that did manage to surface. I wish the complicated tale of Donnie's downfall played better with audiences, but commercially, it is a big ask to employ main perspective from the villain's eyes. Even so, I think this will be one video nasty that while I didn't objectively love, I liked it quite a bit, and I'd be happy to recommend it to folks.
Mike, thank you so much for your time today. You've really been awesome, and I'd love to have you back someday. But for anyone who's enjoyed what you've had to say, would you mind telling us where people can find you?
Primarily, I'm on YouTube with my channel of Rotted Reviews, oftentimes taking spoiler-free looks at new horror VOD and streaming releases that may not get quite as much exposure as mainstream blockbusters.
Fantastic stuff, and thank you so much again.
Thank you very much. I had a blast. I appreciate you having me on. Take care.
Well, that's us for the time being. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you when the new season launches right here on September 9th. Thank you, and have an awesome summer. Till next time.